All right, guys, we're back with another buff to Izumo no Okuni on JP. As you guys know, the Gouda 6 event is rerunning, and immediately on the onset of this event, she ends up getting some love. And it's really nice that they actually did revisit her, because obviously this is a perfect, synergistic time for them to do so in the story. But frankly speaking, our single target casters are not in the best spot right now. There's sort of this looming shadow that is kind of towering over all of them, and her name is Melt. So Okuni definitely needed some love, as almost all of the other single target casters do. And we're going to kind of make the case for that, and why I think this is both a good buff, but maybe also not enough. So real quick here, just to remind you guys on Okuni's capabilities, she's single target, she's quick, she's a 50% charger, she's anti-demonic. She has a lot of good stuff in her kit, including 100% crit damage. The biggest issue that she kind of has is just overall damage output. Her refund is fairly solid. She has naturally high NP gain, even for a quick unit. The big problem that she has is, again, sort of just the capacity to be able to amplify damage as much as possible, and maybe some party utility. And that's actually what they kind of tried to do here with the buff to her first skill, Aragoto Dance. So this skill originally is just a quick and buster up of 3 turns at 30% each. It's her survivability with 2 attacks evasion over 3 turns. It's definitely a nice skill. Its biggest issue, though, is it is on a 7-turn cooldown, and as far as steroids go, it's just not particularly strong for her herself. So they actually come back in and they revisit this, and they say, you know what? We are going to reduce the cooldown overall here down to 6 turns, helping her get back to it a little bit faster, since she does have cooldown reduction in her kit as well. So this is going to mean that she can get to it even quicker, and you're going to have a lot more uptime out of it. But then on top of that, they also grant it the ability to increase the party's NP damage for 3 turns, which is really funny given that the buff that they had literally just yesterday was Lartoria giving the entire party NP damage. So they come back and they do it again. This one is not nearly as strong as Lartoria's, though. This one is just a 20% NP damage up to the party. But what this does tell me is the devs are kind of realizing this is what players want. We want NP damage because Oberon and his scaling is just so nutty. So it definitely is going to help her out in that regard. You're going to be able to double up the source of this with an Oberon in your party, and Okuni is someone who can utilize Oberon in a conventional 3-turn setup for her. Now, the idea here, though, is that this doesn't necessarily get used that often. That is to say, you're not going to sit there and just 3-turn with Okuni all the time. A lot of the time, you're going to be using a single target caster either for one-shot damage or in a sort of multiple damage dealer setup to maybe take out an odd wave where it's just one enemy, or maybe to handle the final high health enemy at the end of a node. So that's usually where they find their claim to fame. You do occasionally get them in, a challenge composition where you're going up against the nasty assassin boss. But I do think this is something that Okuni was already pretty okay at in that regard. So this is just kind of trying to expand those capabilities of when you would use her with other party members as just one of the pieces of the puzzle, and again, to just kind of amplify her damage output. And this does satisfy that to some degree. Now, in order to talk about this, let's go ahead, let's look at Okuni's actual refund numbers here. As you guys can see on the screen right now, she's somebody that, obviously, depending on what you're facing, is going to have a little bit of a different refund scenario, but ultimately, at the end of the day, she's not going to be your Black Grail Looper type of unit. This is just one of those downsides to being a quick unit a lot of the times that really can hold a unit back. But admittedly, if you are getting a lot of mileage out of carding after the NP, maybe because you're in a challenge environment, you got break bars abounding and stuff like that, it can definitely be something that you could use to her advantage to maybe start her from an even more beneficial starting charge standpoint. With that in mind, a lot of the time you're going to be wanting to run a 60% CE on her if you're trying to 3-turn, maybe even just a normal K-scope. But I do think you can probably stretch this within reason to something like a 50% C at minimum, and maybe even if you're really lucky, something like Black Grail. If you're just looking for one-shot damage, then obviously Black Grail is going to be your go-to, and there are numerous really good 50% CEs that she can absolutely use if she is in a multiple damage dealer setup. But with that in mind, if you are trying to 3-turn with her, you're going to see that her refund numbers a lot of the time get her somewhere back to 20 to 30% refund. That's going to be the goal, is to try to get her to 30% ideally. That way you can have that nice combination with like a 50% charge and then maybe someone else's 20%, like a Reigns or an Oberon or something like that, that can kind of break up their charge a little bit. So that's where it'll help her out quite a bit more. And I do think that should be your goal. It's not impossible to hit, but you will need pretty high overkill counts in order to get to that number. So just keep that in mind. And this is where I'm going to say again, carding can be a factor if you're using her in a challenge environment. So even if you maybe don't get enough refund, you can maybe get a little bit more out of something like that. So in that regard, I don't think her refund's actually the biggest of her concerns. She does still have the 50% charge in her kit, so you can do a lot with that. But from there, let's go ahead and let's talk about an actual 3-turn charge scenario. This is where I talked about, again, something like a 60% C really helping you out. In this scenario, we're going to have her maxed out mana loading, a 60% CE equipped, double Summer Scotty, and Oberon. But we're actually going to have Oberon in the party to begin with, which means we'll only have a singular Scotty's buffs on turn 1. What you're going to do is the Append and the Seer are going to make up 80% of her charge. Oberon's going to have his first skill that you're going to pop right there. That's going to get, again, 20% more to max her out. You're then going to want to basically end up popping Okuni's first skill right there and, you know, get a little bit of those steroids, as well as Scotty's, you know, the singular Scotty that you have, her quick up and attack up on her. That's going to get you enough. You're going to fire off the NP the first time. You're going to refund about only like 16% off of something like that. So it's not going to be too good for you, but it should be enough in order to like make do. So at this point in turn 2, you're going to go ahead and want to pop her third skill, her charge skill there for 50%, and then go ahead and get the Scotty's 50% charge skill, rotate her for the other Summer Scotty, bring her in, have her first and second skill get popped on Okuni, fire off the NP again, and then that should get you about 20% refund. Still not great, but still something that you can kind of brute force, since you will now have in turn 3 the last remaining Scotty's 50% charge skill, as well as Oberon's 50%. So you're going to pop that, you're going to pop Oberon's third skill, you're going to pop the Mystic Code attack buff, and that should be able to complete your 3-turn loop should you need to with Okuni. Taking a look at the damage numbers here, first we're going to start out with raw numbers. These are her old numbers before the buff. Now, again, giving you guys some idea about this, you're not going to see a huge jump in damage output here, but there will be some. So remember, she does have the demonic niche. She's not like a welfare or anything like that, so we're just going to kind of talk NP1 numbers here. If you have a stronger one, obviously it's going to help the scaling. And you guys can see here, there is a little bit of a relationship, as NP1 in the demonic niche, those raw numbers without any sort of external buffs, is the same as having her at NP3 without the niche. So that's just kind of the scalability of that demonic modifier in her kit. But now with the new buffs here, you're actually going to see slightly different numbers, though the relationship remains the same. Obviously the numbers go up, good thing for us in that regard, so this definitely is going to help out her damage output long term, as well as give her that extra party utility. But even then, the anti-demonic damage is still going to be exactly equal to your NP3 damage without the demonic niche. So interesting to see how that relationship is preserved just by adding a little bit more NP damage to the mix. Now, as we start to look at Okuni's numbers in a proper composition here, again, we have multiple ways that we can showcase this. Obviously, 3-turn scenarios are a thing, but, you know, given the nature of casters and how a lot of them work, and really just in general a single target unit, I think it's actually better to look a little bit more at one-shot damage potential, because that is predominantly where a lot of people do use them. So obviously, if we're looking at the 3-turn, that scenario is going to be using double Summer Scotty, Oberon, a level 100 Knights and Marines is maybe your best pick there. And you're going to see, you know, some scalability in the damage output. Every single wave is going to get better, with wave 3 finally culminating at about 323k neutral damage. So not effective, but still really, really solid neutral damage in that regard. If you do have demonic energy there, then that's pretty much going to make your first wave almost as good as your second wave without it. The second wave will be even higher with another massive jump, and then the third wave will quite literally be almost 150k higher than it without the niche. So really, really solid damage if you're actually using her against a demonic unit in that third turn. When we look at her one-shot damage potential, so this is just popping all the buffs turn one, trying to get the most we can out of her, then we can get away with something like Black Grail, because obviously you're going to have plenty of charge in that scenario. Her one-shot, one-turn damage is going to be about 526k, which is definitely not bad, but it's also not like the most crazy damage in the game at this point. Her anti-demonic damage is 789, which is kind of absurd, but you're actually going to see it's not that absurd as we start to look at some of these other numbers here. And what do I mean by some of these other numbers? I mean, well, we have that shadow that I talked about earlier, and that shadow is Melt. So as you guys look, Melt's 3-turn numbers are certainly looking a little bit better than Okuni's in that regard, but where she really just kind of makes that huge jump is in that one-shot damage potential. She just absolutely takes off. This is where I look at that Melt buff historically, and it was really, really strong, and I really question what the devs were doing at this point, because even in niche for Okuni, she does not beat this number, and it's still, like, it's close, but it's not that close. We're talking, like, almost 100k of difference right here. So it really makes you wonder why the devs decided to make Melt as strong as she is. Granted, keep in mind, these are neutral numbers. So comparing neutrality there, obviously in most of these scenarios, you're not going to want to take Melt in a scenario that she'd be neutral. You're not going to want to take Okuni in a scenario that she'd be neutral. It's important to keep in mind that, like, say in Melt's case, this number against another cavalry class like an assassin, where Okuni would be at her strongest, this number is only going to be multiplied by 1.5 times. That's still a really big number. But Okuni's gets multiplied by 2 times due to her being the actually effective class. So in that regard, Okuni will still have the edge, and it will still be her advantage. But that is just the sheer firepower that Melt brings, and that is definitely going to outshine some of the other casters in that regard, and make you kind of head scratch and wonder why they haven't either buffed some of the other casters, or why they decided to make Melt this strong in the first place. So as we look at some of the other options here for kind of what we can compare to, I asked Avalon to run me some numbers for some of the other casters in the game, like Castoria. That is to say, Castoria Berserker. So Castoria Berserker is going to be one that's going to be coming out later this year, obviously, you guys know. And we can look at this and we can see, in a similar way to like Melt, we have a lot of capacity for damage output and 3-turning. But we do also have the potential to have power mods in her case and one-shot damage. So basically, Castoria Berserker has quite a bit of extra scalability here. Granted, same deal, you're going to have that 1.5 times modifier as opposed to Okuni's 2 times. This does mean that Okuni pairs quite favorably in a lot of these scenarios if we're looking at both 1-turn and 3-turn damage. Just keep in mind that this is a unit that you can use practically anywhere. So obviously Castoria Berserker has a lot of mileage, a lot of utility, even if her niches aren't in play. And if they are in play, she's absolutely a, like, just disgustingly good unit, as I'm sure many people will tell you later this year. And then next up here, I also wanted to look at Draco, because interestingly enough, Draco's gotten a lot of crap from people over the past couple months here, and I'm really still just not sure why. You can absolutely automate a 3-turn loop with Draco, and her damage is definitely disgusting in the right set of circumstances. So same deal with Draco, she also has power mods that can really come into play for her, and you're looking at, you know, again, pretty insane numbers for her, both in a 3-turn environment as well as one-shot damage potential. So I see a lot of people kind of sliding her, and the reality is she is really still very powerful. Don't write her off. She'll still definitely be useful to your account later on. And then last but not least, I think the one I wanted to compare to a little bit was another caster. Like, how are we kind of faring in that regard? So you can see, at least with regards to San Zhang here, you have maybe a little bit less in terms of 3-turn numbers. This is going to be due to her having to resort to something like a 60% C in order to be able to 3-turn. It's kind of just her best case scenario at the moment. But then if you start to look at one-shot damage, all of a sudden San Zhang definitely gets a little bit more firepower. You do have the capability of like tapping into the man niche if it's available due to Korean Sky of Light being used in the comp, but you don't have a true niche like Okuni does. So if it's demonic, advantage is absolutely going to be to Okuni. But otherwise, definitely see some pretty strong numbers there out of San Zhang that can really help her out, pretty much just on par with Okuni at this point after this upgrade. And San Zhang was one of the single target casters that actually had received quite a bit of attention. This is an interesting thing to see, but again, I do think the single target casters are not like in the hey, I'm completely destroyed category yet, but that melt strength is definitely something that needs to be like watched very carefully, as some of them could definitely use some pick-me-ups to try and kind of keep pace with her. So anyways, what do you guys think about the Okuni buff? Do you guys think that she should have actually gotten one? Do you like the buff that she got? Do you think they should have done more for her? And, you know, who would you like to see them buff next coming up on JP? I'll be curious to hear you guys' thoughts. Thank you guys for watching, and if you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. I will see you guys for the next one. Later.